Envigado, Colombia, 1975. There is a neighborhood gathering, the kind common to working-class barrios on a Sunday afternoon, where families set out plastic chairs on concrete and children run between adults' legs. Maria Victoria Henao is 15 years old. She is wearing a white dress. Pablo Escobar is 25, already known in certain circles for reasons that polite conversation avoided, and he sees her across the gathering and decides, with the particular certainty of men who have rarely been told no, that she is the one he wants to marry. She does not know this yet. She is 15. What follows is not a love story, though it will be described as one for decades, by Pablo himself, by journalists, and eventually carefully, by Maria Victoria. It is something quieter and more complicated than love. It is the story of a girl who was chosen before she had the chance to choose, and who spent the next 18 years, and the 30 years after that, trying to understand what had been done to her and what she had done in return. This is not a story about Pablo Escobar's empire. That story has been told many times, in many languages, on many screens. This is the story of the woman who sat at his table, raised his children, carried his name, and watched everything around her burn. And what it costs a person to survive that, and whether survival in the end is the same thing as living. In 1975, Envigado was a municipality just south of Medellin, close enough to the city to feel its ambitions, far enough away to maintain the rhythms of a place where families knew each other's business and reputation moved faster than money. The Henao family was unremarkable by the standards of the barrio. Mario Henao, Maria Victoria's father, worked. Her mother, Nora, kept the household. They were Catholic, modest, and like most families in that part of Antioquia, they organized their lives around a set of unspoken rules about respect, appearances, and the authority of men. Pablo Escobar did not yet have the profile he would later acquire. He was not yet a cartel boss, not yet a name that appeared in newspapers. But he was known. In Envigado and in the neighborhood surrounding Medellin, he had already begun to accumulate the kind of reputation that exists below the surface of official life. Small-time smuggling, suspected involvement in car thefts, connections to people who solve problems with violence. He was not wealthy yet, not by the standards he would later set, but he had money enough to be noticed, and he had around him the particular atmosphere of a man going somewhere that others could sense without being able to name. When Pablo Escobar decided he wanted to marry Maria Victoria Henao, she was 15 and he was 25. The age difference alone, in another context, might have raised concern. It did not, or if it did, that concern was not expressed in any form that reached him. What is documented through Maria Victoria's own later account, through the recollections of family members, and through Pablo's own words in interviews he gave years later, is that he pursued her with a consistency that left little room for alternatives. He came to the neighborhood. He made himself visible to her family. He spoke to her father. In the social architecture of that time and place, this was courtship conducted through the correct channels, which meant that the question of what Maria Victoria herself wanted was not structurally the primary question being asked. She has said in accounts given decades later that she was in love with him. This is worth taking seriously, not dismissing. 15-year-old girls can feel genuine emotion. They can also feel the particular pull of attention from an older man who has decided with complete confidence that they are extraordinary, especially when the world they inhabit has not yet offered them many other mirrors in which to see themselves as remarkable. Pablo told her she was beautiful. He told her she was special. He was 10 years older, which at 15 can feel like wisdom rather than warning. Her mother, Nora, was opposed. This is one of the clearest early facts in the record, and it is significant not because it changed anything, but because it did not. Nora Henao understood something about Pablo Escobar that her 15-year-old daughter could not have been expected to understand, that the atmosphere around him was not ambition in the ordinary sense, but something with a different weight to it. She told Maria Victoria to end the contact. She expressed her concerns to her husband. What happened next is a quiet study in how families make decisions when the pressure being applied is not quite a threat, but is not quite not a threat either. Pablo did not disappear when Nora objected. He continued to come around. He was patient in the way that people are patient when they are confident the outcome is already determined. Mario Henao, Maria Victoria's father, did not ultimately hold the line his wife had drawn. The reasons for this are not fully documented, but the pattern itself, a man of growing local influence applying sustained pressure on a working-class family until resistance dissolved, was not unusual for the context, and it would repeat itself throughout Pablo Escobar's life in larger and more violent forms. Maria Victoria was removed from school. This detail appears in her own later account and in biographical records, and it is easy to pass over quickly, but it should not be. She was 15, in school, with the ordinary future that schooling implies. Years ahead of her, possibilities not yet closed. Pablo wanted her available. He wanted her time. The education ended. The specific stated reason varies across accounts, but the timing is consistent. Once Pablo's courtship intensified, her schooling stopped. They were married on March 22, 1976. Maria Victoria Henao was 15 years old. Pablo Escobar was 26. The wedding took place in a small ceremony. There are photographs. She looks young in them, which is not a remarkable thing to say about a 15-year-old. But it is remarkable to look at those photographs knowing what the years ahead contained and to observe how completely ordinary the image appears. A young woman in a dress, a man beside her, a moment that looks like a beginning. Under Colombian law at the time, the marriage was not straightforwardly legal. The legal age of marriage without parental consent was 18. With parental consent, exceptions existed. The documentation surrounding the marriage has been a subject of some scrutiny over the years, with questions raised about whether the paperwork accurately reflected Maria Victoria's age. Some records indicate her age was misrepresented to make the marriage administratively possible. Maria Victoria has addressed this in later interviews, acknowledging that her age on the marriage documents may not have been correct. She has framed this as something that happened around her, a detail managed by others, which may be accurate. A 15-year-old is not typically the one managing her own legal paperwork, but the fact of it remains. The marriage that defined her life began with a document that misrepresented who she was. In the months following the wedding, Pablo's activities continued to expand. He was not yet the figure he would become, but the infrastructure of what he would become was being assembled. There were trips she did not ask about. There were men who came to the house whose function was not explained. There were absences. Maria Victoria was 16, newly married, living in a world that had contracted from the ordinary span of a teenage girl's life to the interior of a household organized around a man whose real activities were, from the beginning, something she was not fully permitted to see. She cooked, she kept the house, she waited for him to come home. This is not a dramatic image. That is precisely the point. The earliest stage of what would become one of the most extreme domestic situations in 20th century Latin American history looked, from the inside, like an ordinary young marriage in a working-class Colombian barrio. The confinement did not announce itself. It settled in quietly, the way that arrangements do when no single moment is severe enough to force a reckoning. But the cumulative weight of small adjustments adds up over months and years, to a life that has been entirely reorganized around someone else's needs. She was 16. She had no high school diploma. She had no income of her own. She had a husband who was already, in ways she could not fully see, becoming something that the world outside their door was beginning to take notice of. And she had no road back to the girl in the white dress at the neighborhood gathering, because that girl had already, quietly, been replaced. By 1976, the cocaine trade moving through Colombia had begun its transformation from a regional criminal enterprise into something that would reshape the economies of two continents. The demand coming out of the United States was accelerating faster than anyone in law enforcement had anticipated, and the men positioned to meet that demand, men with existing smuggling networks, with the willingness to apply violence, and with the organizational instinct to scale an operation, were accumulating wealth at a speed that had no precedent in the world Maria Victoria had grown up in. Pablo Escobar was one of those men. He had not yet reached the upper levels of what the trade would make possible, but he was moving. The car theft operations and small smuggling runs of his early 20s were giving way to something larger, and the money, when it began to arrive in serious quantities, arrived faster than any legitimate business could have explained. Maria Victoria was 16, then 17. She was living in Envigado in a house that was better than the one she had grown up in, with a husband who was gone frequently, and who, when he was present, did not explain where he had been. She has described this period in later interviews as one in which she understood, in a general way, that Pablo was involved in things that were not legal, but in which the specific nature of those things remained unclear to her. This claim has been met with skepticism by journalists and prosecutors over the years, and the skepticism is not unreasonable. But it is also worth considering the conditions under which her knowledge was managed. She was a teenager. She had no independent income, no education beyond early secondary school, no social network outside the one Pablo controlled. The information she received about her own life was filtered through him and through the people around him who answered to him. What she could see was the money, and the money in the late 1970s was becoming impossible to ignore. The first significant physical evidence of Pablo's wealth in their shared life came in the form of property. He began buying land, not the modest lots of a working man improving his position, but large tracts, farms, estates, holdings that announced a different order of financial scale entirely. Maria Victoria moved with him as the addresses changed, from the modest house in Envigado to larger properties, each one a step further from the neighborhood where she had grown up, and a step further into a world that operated by different rules. In 1978, Pablo was arrested for the first time on drug charges. He was held briefly. The charges were later dropped, and the two judges involved in the case died in the years that followed, under circumstances that were never officially resolved. Maria Victoria was 18 years old when this happened. She has said she was frightened. She has also said that Pablo reassured her, told her it was a misunderstanding, told her it would be resolved. It was resolved. But the manner of its resolution, which even at the time was not entirely invisible to people paying attention, was a piece of information about the world she was living in that could not be fully unseen. The social geography of their life was changing. Pablo was not simply accumulating money. He was constructing a specific kind of visibility in Medellin and in the surrounding municipalities. He gave money to poor neighborhoods, football pitches, housing projects, infrastructure that the state had never provided. In the barrios of Medellin, his name began to carry the particular resonance that comes when someone with resources pays attention to people who have been ignored. This was deliberate. It was also effective. And it meant that Pablo was becoming, in certain circles, something closer to a public figure than a private criminal. For Maria Victoria, this shift had specific consequences. She was no longer simply the wife of a man whose activities were quietly illicit. She was becoming the wife of someone who was acquiring a social profile, which meant that she was acquiring one too. A secondary reflected profile that she had not sought and could not control. When Pablo appeared at community events, she appeared beside him. When journalists began to take notice of his philanthropy, she was part of the image. She smiled in photographs. She stood at his side. She wore the clothes appropriate to the role. She was 19, 20, 21. She had grown up in a culture where a wife's public behavior was understood as a direct reflection of the household's respectability, which meant that her appearance at Pablo's side was not simply companionship. It was endorsement, whether she understood it in those terms or not. Every photograph, every public appearance, every smile directed at a camera was a document of her participation in the image he was constructing. There were other women. This is not a peripheral detail. Pablo Escobar's extramarital relationships were not discreet. They were, by multiple accounts, including those of people close to him, consistent features of his life from early in the marriage. Maria Victoria has addressed this in her memoirs and in interviews with a kind of exhausted directness that suggests she processed it over decades rather than in a single moment of confrontation. She knew. She has said she knew. She has also said she tolerated it, and when pressed on why, her answers tend to settle on a combination of love, fear, and the absence of any visible alternative. The fear is worth pausing on. It would be easy to read Maria Victoria's tolerance of Pablo's infidelities as a cultural artifact, the stoic wife of machismo tradition, accepting what cannot be changed. But the specific texture of her fear was not simply about infidelity. By the late 1970s, she was living with a man who had demonstrated, in ways that required no explicit statement, that people who created problems for him encountered consequences. The judges whose charges disappeared, the men in the neighborhood who stopped appearing, the atmosphere in the house on certain evenings when Pablo returned in a state that foreclosed conversation. The fear was not abstract. It was architectural. It was built into the structure of the life she was living, and it shaped what questions she asked, what she responded to, and what she let pass in silence. In 1979, she became pregnant with their first child. Juan Pablo Escobar, Upo, who would later rename himself Sebastián Marroquín, was born in February 1977. The pregnancy and the birth reorganized Maria Victoria's daily life in ways that both gave her something that was entirely hers and simultaneously deepened her dependence on Pablo's world. A child required stability, required resources, required safety. All of those things in the life she was living came through Pablo. There was no version of her child's security that did not run through him. She was 20 years old with an infant, living in a house funded by cocaine, married to a man who was becoming one of the most dangerous people in Colombia, and who was also, in the private register of her life, the father of her child and the person she had loved since she was 15. These things were all true at the same time. They did not resolve each other. Pablo's operation continued to expand through 1979 and into 1980. The Medellin cartel, as it would come to be known, was taking shape. A network of traffickers, enforcers, lawyers, accountants, and corrupted officials that would eventually move an estimated 80% of the cocaine entering the United States. Pablo was not yet at the apex of this structure, but he was moving toward it with the same patient, certain momentum he had brought to his courtship of a 15-year-old girl in a white dress. Maria Victoria watched the house fill with men she did not know, with conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, with money that appeared in quantities that no cover story could adequately explain. She fed her son. She managed the household. She asked the questions she was permitted to ask and did not ask the ones she had learned, through small accumulating lessons, were not permitted. The money kept coming. The house kept getting larger. And the distance between the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming kept widening, quietly, without announcement, the way distances do when no single day marks the change, but every day moves slightly further from where you started. In 1978, Pablo Escobar began acquiring land in the Magdalena Medio region of Colombia, in the municipality of Puerto Triunfo, Antioquia. The property he assembled there would eventually cover approximately 3,000 hectares. He named it Hacienda Nápoles. By the early 1980s, it had become something that did not have a precise category in the ordinary world. Part ranch, part private zoo, part fortress, part performance of a particular kind of power that needed to be seen to be believed. There were exotic animals, hippos, elephants, giraffes, rhinos. Animals that Pablo had imported illegally from Africa and other parts of the world, housed on the property in conditions that announced, above everything else, that the man who owned this land operated outside the systems that governed other people's behavior. There was a runway. There was a sculpture of the small plane that had carried his first cocaine shipment to the United States, mounted at the entrance to the estate like a trophy. There were guest houses, swimming pools, a bull ring. There were cars, hundreds of them, including antique vehicles that had no practical purpose beyond their existence as objects of impossible accumulation. And there was Maria Victoria, who was expected to call this home. She has described Hacienda Nápoles in her later accounts with a flatness that is more revealing than any dramatic statement could be. She speaks of its size, its strangeness, the way it required a kind of performance from everyone who lived there or visited, a sustained acknowledgement that what you were seeing was normal, that the scale of it was acceptable, that the obvious questions raised by its existence were not questions worth asking aloud. She brought her son there. She would later bring her daughter there. She arranged her life within its perimeter and presented, to the journalists and visitors and associates who moved through it, the image of a woman comfortable in her surroundings. In 1984, their daughter Manuela was born. Maria Victoria was 24. She now had two children, a son of 7 and an infant daughter, and a husband whose wealth had reached a scale that generated its own kind of unreality. The house was not simply large, it was an argument, a sustained, physical argument that Pablo Escobar could not be touched, that the rules applied to other people, that the state and its apparatus were things he had already accounted for and neutralized. Living inside that argument day after day had a specific effect on the people who did it. For the children, it meant growing up in a world without ordinary proportion, where want was not a concept that had any practical meaning, where the exotic was routine, where the men who stood at the edges of every gathering were not guests, but guards. For Maria Victoria, it meant something different. It meant managing a household that was also, always, a statement of her husband's power, which meant that the household's appearance was never entirely domestic. Every gathering at Hacienda Nápoles was also a demonstration. Every meal, every social occasion, every moment in which she moved through those spaces, as Pablo's wife, was a moment in which she was participating in the argument the property was making. The rumors about Pablo's violence were not rumors by the early 1980s, not to anyone paying attention. The 1981 kidnapping of Marta Nieves Ochoa, sister of the Ochoa brothers, who were among Pablo's closest cartel associates, had prompted the formation of Mas Muertes Secuestradores, a paramilitary group assembled by the cartel to respond to guerrilla kidnappings with coordinated violence. Pablo was centrally involved. The group's activities were not subtle. Bodies appeared. The message was explicit. This was not something that occurred in a distant criminal underworld entirely separate from Maria Victoria's domestic life. It occurred in the same social world she inhabited, involving men who came to the house, who sat at the table, whose names she knew. In the same period, Pablo was building his political profile. He had aligned himself with a Liberal Party politician named Alberto Santofimio Botero, who helped facilitate his entry into Colombian politics as an alternate representative to the Chamber of Deputies. In 1982, Pablo attended congressional sessions in Bogotá. He appeared in official photographs. He gave interviews. He sat in the chambers of the Colombian legislature as a duly elected representative of the people of Antioquia. Maria Victoria appeared at political events during this period. She was Pablo's wife in a public, documented, photographed sense. There are images from this time, receptions, official gatherings, the particular formality of political social life, in which she is present, dressed appropriately, performing the role of the congressman's wife. She was 22, 23 years old. She had a young child. She smiled at cameras. The political career lasted less than 2 years. In 1983, the Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla publicly exposed Pablo's criminal record and his connection to the drug trade, producing documents that made his presence in the legislature untenable. Pablo was stripped of his congressional immunity. The political project collapsed. Lara Bonilla was assassinated the following year, shot by gunmen on a motorcycle in Bogotá. Pablo was widely understood to have ordered the killing. He fled to Panama briefly with his family. Maria Victoria was in Panama with him. This is not a small fact. When Pablo Escobar fled Colombia following the assassination of a government minister, an assassination widely attributed to him, his wife and children went with him. They stayed for a period in Panama before returning to Colombia. The logistics of this movement, the decision-making it involved, the knowledge it required of what had happened and why. These are things Maria Victoria has addressed only partially in her later accounts. She was there. She left with him. She came back with him. Back in Colombia, the situation continued its escalation. Pablo declared war on extradition, the legal mechanism by which the Colombian government could transfer drug traffickers to face trial in the United States. This was not simply a legal or political position. It was a campaign of targeted assassination against anyone who supported or might support extradition: judges, politicians, police officers, journalists. The list of people killed in the years between 1984 and Pablo's death in 1993 runs into the hundreds. The specific targeting of civilians, of public servants, of journalists. This occurred while Maria Victoria was living as his wife, raising his children, managing his household. At Hacienda Nápoles, in this same period, life continued with the particular texture it had established. Visitors came, family members, associates, the children of cartel figures who played with Juan Pablo and Manuela in the grounds of the estate. There were birthday parties. There are photographs of Manuela as a small child on the grounds of the property, surrounded by the exotic animals, smiling in the way children smile when the world they inhabit is the only world they know. Maria Victoria organized these gatherings. She managed the domestic life of a household operating under conditions of increasing military and law enforcement pressure, while the man at the center of it prosecuted a war against the Colombian state that was killing people at a pace that was, even by the standards of the era, extraordinary. She has said she prayed. She has said she tried to keep the children's lives as normal as possible. She has said in the careful language of someone who has spent decades thinking about how to describe the indescribable that she did not know the full extent of what was happening. The hippos at Hacienda Nápoles are still there. Pablo brought them in the early 1980s, and when the estate was seized by the Colombian government after his death, the hippos could not be removed. They have bred in the rivers and lakes of the Magdalena Medio region and now number in the dozens, spreading through the Colombian waterways, an ecological disruption with no clear solution. Biologists call them an invasive species. They arrived because a man wanted to demonstrate that he could have anything, and they outlasted him, and they continue to move through the landscape he briefly dominated, indifferent to everything that came after. Maria Victoria did not choose the hippos. She did not choose the runway, or the plane sculpture, or the bull ring, or the hundreds of cars. But she lived among them, and she raised her children among them, and she smiled in the photographs taken in their vicinity. And the photographs exist. Juan Pablo Escobar was 7 years old when his father fled to Panama. Manuela was an infant. Maria Victoria was 24, moving between countries with 2 children and a husband who had just been publicly identified as the man behind the assassination of a government minister. The ordinary scaffolding of a family life, school schedules, neighborhood routines, the social texture of a child's daily existence had already begun to dissolve into something more contingent, more provisional, organized around security requirements rather than anything resembling a normal calendar. Motherhood, under these conditions, became the one role Maria Victoria inhabited that was entirely and unambiguously hers. Not in the sense that it offered freedom, it did not, but in the sense that it could not be managed or directed by Pablo in the same way that her public appearances, her social behavior, and her domestic arrangements could be. The children needed her in a way that was not mediated by his authority. They needed her presence, her constancy, her ability to make the extraordinary feel ordinary, and she provided this consistently across years that would have broken most people's capacity for routine. Juan Pablo, by multiple accounts, including his own memoir published in 2014 under the name Sebastián Marroquín, grew up understanding his father as a figure of enormous force and intermittent presence, someone who appeared with the intensity of a weather event and departed leaving the household reorganized around his absence. He has written about his mother during these years with a specificity that is painful to read, her efforts to maintain normalcy, her habit of cooking familiar food in whatever temporary residence they were occupying, her insistence on certain rituals of domesticity that had nothing to do with the scale of the houses they moved through, and everything to do with the fact that she was trying to give her children something stable to stand on. Manuela Escobar's childhood was more circumscribed even than her brother's. Born in 1984, she came into a world that was already in open conflict. By the time she was old enough to form continuous memories, her father was a fugitive. The properties and the animals and the extraordinary material abundance of her early childhood at Hacienda Nápoles gave way as she grew to the interior of guarded residences, to the company of bodyguards and her immediate family, to a social world that contracted year by year as the danger around Pablo intensified. Maria Victoria has spoken about her daughter with particular care in her accounts, a carefulness that suggests the subject is still decades later not fully settled for her. Manuela was, by multiple descriptions, Pablo's favorite. He was extravagant in his affection for her, in the particular way of men who lavish on their children the attentiveness they withhold from their wives. He wrote her letters. He remembered her preferences. He arranged, even from hiding, to make her birthdays remarkable. Maria Victoria was present for all of this, the attentive, organizing presence through which Pablo's affection for his daughter was actually made to happen, while occupying a different register of his attention entirely. This asymmetry between Pablo's relationship with his children and his relationship with his wife was one of the private textures of the household that outside observers rarely had access to. In his public and criminal life, Pablo projected a kind of domestic mythology. He was, in his own self-presentation, a family man. He cited his children when he wanted to appear human. He invoked the image of his wife and family when strategic sympathy was useful. Maria Victoria was part of the mythology, which meant she was useful to him in a way that was distinct from, and sometimes in tension with, whatever the actual emotional reality of their relationship was at any given moment. In 1984, around the time of Manuela's birth, the pressure on Pablo's operation was increasing significantly. The assassination of Lara Bonilla had brought unprecedented government attention, and Pablo had responded by going further underground, moving more frequently, using more intermediaries, making himself harder to locate. The family followed this movement. Maria Victoria packed and unpacked in a succession of residences across Antioquia and beyond. She managed the children's education during these years through tutors and private arrangements because ordinary school attendance, showing up at the same place on the same schedule, with the same name on the enrollment forms, was not possible for Pablo Escobar's children. Juan Pablo has described in his memoir a specific incident from this period that illuminates what daily life inside the household actually looked like. He was approximately 10 years old, in a residence that was not their permanent home, when bodyguards arrived in a state of agitation that signaled danger without explaining its nature. The family was moved quickly to another location. His mother, he writes, did not ask questions in front of the children. She gathered what was necessary, organized them, moved. It was only later, much later, that he understood the full context of what had been happening around him, that the calm his mother projected during these relocations was not the absence of fear, but its careful management, performed for his and his sister's benefit. This is the specific labor that Maria Victoria performed across the years of Pablo's fugitive existence, and it has no name in the historical record, because it was domestic and maternal and therefore largely invisible to the people writing down what happened. She was not signing orders or managing logistics of the cartel's operations. She was keeping two children functional and emotionally intact inside conditions of sustained, unresolvable danger, while also managing her own terror and grief and whatever remained of her sense of who she was outside the roles she was performing. The mistresses continued to be a presence in the household's emotional life during this period, and the particular cruelty of this, that Pablo continued his extramarital relationships through years of upheaval, years in which Maria Victoria was, by any measure, sustaining his family almost entirely on her own, is something she has addressed with a kind of resignation that takes decades to develop. There was one relationship in particular with a woman named Virginia Vallejo, a prominent Colombian television journalist, that lasted several years in the early to mid-1980s, and was, by Vallejo's own extensively published account, not discreet. Vallejo wrote a memoir in which she described the relationship in detail, including encounters that overlapped directly with the period of Manuela's infancy. Maria Victoria knew, she has said she knew in general terms, and the specific case of Vallejo was not obscure. It was known in Colombian media circles, known to people in Pablo's social world, and therefore inevitably known to her. What she did with this knowledge was, again, the same thing she had done with every other piece of information that presented itself as impossible to act on. She held it. She continued. She managed the household and the children and the public appearance of a functioning family. In 1987, Juan Pablo was 10. Manuela was 3. The cartel's war against the Colombian state was producing casualties at a rate that was making international headlines. Car bombs, assassinations, the systematic killing of police officers in Medellin. Pablo had put a bounty on the heads of law enforcement, and young men from the city's poorest neighborhoods were collecting it. The city was in a condition of something close to open urban warfare, and Maria Victoria was raising her children inside it, in houses with armed guards at the doors and protocols for what to do when certain kinds of information arrived. There is a photograph from approximately this period. The specific date is not precisely documented, that appears in several accounts of the family's life. It shows Pablo with Juan Pablo and Manuela in a domestic setting, the children young, the image warm with the particular visual grammar of a family photograph. Maria Victoria is not in the photograph. She was, presumably, the one who arranged the conditions in which it was taken, who had the children dressed, who managed the logistics of the moment. She is present in the photograph's existence and absent from its image. This is, in concentrated form, the position she occupied for years. The person who made the life possible, who sustained the conditions in which others appeared, who kept the children fed and schooled and emotionally tethered to something resembling stability, and who appeared in the record mostly as an absence, a necessary background against which other people's stories unfolded. Juan Pablo grew up watching his father and absorbing, through proximity and example, a particular model of how a man moves through the world. With force, with certainty, with the assumption that the people around him will organize themselves according to his needs. He has written, in his memoir, about the process of consciously dismantling this inheritance, of recognizing in himself the patterns his father had installed and working, deliberately and with significant effort, to replace them with something different. This is to his considerable credit. But the process he describes, of identifying a learned model of dominance and choosing to reject it, is also, indirectly, a description of what his mother lived inside for 18 years without the language or the distance to name it. Manuela Escobar's adult life has been one of the most closely guarded in the family. She has not written a memoir. She has not given interviews. She lives, by what little is publicly known, in considerable difficulty, financially, psychologically, and in terms of basic social functioning. The reports that have emerged over the years describe a person profoundly marked by the childhood she had, unable to sustain ordinary life in the way her brother has managed to do. Whether this is a consequence of specific events, of the accumulated weight of the years of her childhood, or of something in her particular temperament and experience that the public record cannot access. These questions remain open. Maria Victoria raised both of these children largely alone, in the specific sense that the parenting, the daily, sustained, emotionally demanding work of it, fell to her. Pablo was present intermittently, intensely, and in ways that were as likely to disrupt the household's equilibrium as to support it. The consistency, the constancy, the ordinary grind of keeping two children moving through childhood in circumstances that were anything but ordinary. This was hers. She did it. The record is clear on this, if on little else about her inner life during these years. She did it, and the children survived their childhoods, and what that cost her is something the record does not fully contain. In 1982, Pablo Escobar won a seat in the Colombian Chamber of Deputies as an alternate representative for the Envigado district, running on a Liberal Party slate associated with the politician Alberto Santofimio Botero. The campaign had not been a secret. Pablo had been building his political infrastructure for several years, funding community projects in Medellin's poorest neighborhoods, constructing housing, paving roads, appearing at public events with the particular visibility of a man who understood that popular affection was a form of protection. When the election came, he won it with the genuine support of people who associated his name with the only material improvements their neighborhoods had seen in years. Maria Victoria was 22 years old when her husband became a member of the Colombian legislature. She had not been consulted about the decision to run. She had not been part of the strategic conversations about which party to align with, which constituency to court, which image to project. These were Pablo's decisions, made in the company of men whose role was to advise and execute. And Maria Victoria's role in the political project was the same as it had been in every other dimension of the life they shared: to appear when required, in the appropriate clothing, with the appropriate expression, and to make the image coherent. The image Pablo was constructing for political purposes was specific. He was presenting himself as a man of the people, a self-made figure from humble origins who had prospered and was now giving back. The wife was a component of this image. A politician needed a family. A family man was trustworthy. Maria Victoria, young and presentable and visibly devoted to her children, served this narrative without needing to say a word. Her presence at events was sufficient. She stood beside him at receptions in Bogota, at constituency gatherings in Antioquia, at the various social occasions that political life generates. And in each of these settings, she was enacting, with her body and her silence, a version of the story Pablo was telling about himself. Bogota was a different world from the one she had grown up in. The political and social circles Pablo was now moving through, congressional receptions, ministerial offices, the carefully managed social terrain of Colombian political life, operated according to a set of codes that Maria Victoria had not been raised in and had not been prepared for. The wives of politicians and businessmen in these circles came from families with education, with social histories, with the particular ease that comes from having grown up inside the class whose approval you were now seeking. Maria Victoria had none of this background. She had a husband with money and a criminal reputation that was, in 1982, not yet fully public knowledge, and she had the ability to dress well and to stay quiet, which was, functionally, what was required of her. She has said very little about this period in her public accounts, which is itself a form of information. The political years, 1982 and 1983, the brief window before the collapse, appear in her narrative as something to be passed through quickly, a chapter that is acknowledged but not dwelt upon. This restraint may reflect genuine emotional distance from events she did not choose and did not control. It may also reflect the particular discomfort of accounting for a period in which her public role was most nakedly instrumental, most clearly a performance staged for someone else's benefit. The congressional sessions Pablo attended in Bogota were documented in the official records of the Chamber of Deputies. He participated, he voted. He sat in the chambers of the Colombian legislature alongside men who had studied law and economics and political science. Men from established families with multi-generational connections to the state's institutions. Pablo Escobar sat among them with the cocaine money that had funded his campaign, with the criminal record that his new immunity temporarily shielded from consequence, and with the absolute certainty that the institution he had entered was, like every other institution he had encountered, something that could be managed. Maria Victoria attended official events in Bogota during this period. There are photographs of her at congressional gatherings, a young woman in formal dress, composed, giving nothing away. She was performing a role in a production whose script she had not read and whose direction she did not control, and the performance was adequate, which was all that was needed from her. In August 1983, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla was appointed Justice Minister by President Belisario Betancourt. Lara Bonilla was one of the few figures in Colombian political life who was prepared to make Pablo's criminal background a matter of public record. He had been making statements in Congress about the infiltration of drug money into political campaigns, and when he became Justice Minister, he moved from rhetoric to documentation. He produced Pablo's criminal record, the 1976 drug arrest, the subsequent charges, the circumstances under which they had been dropped. He made this documentation public. The political career ended within months of Lara Bonilla's appointment. Pablo resigned his congressional seat. The Liberal Party distanced itself. Santofimio, who had facilitated his entry into politics, maintained a more careful public silence. The image that Pablo had constructed, the people's representative, the philanthropist from the barrio, did not survive contact with the documented reality of what he was. For Maria Victoria, the collapse of the political project meant something specific and immediate, the brief period in which her life had a public structure. Events to attend, a social calendar, a defined role in a recognized institution ended, and what replaced it was a return to the more purely domestic, more purely private, more purely constrained existence she had inhabited before. The political years, whatever their costs, had given her a kind of visibility that was at least legible to the outside world. She had been a congressman's wife. There were social conventions for that. There were other congressional wives, events with defined formats, a calendar that organized time in ways that were recognizable. What came after the collapse was not that. Lara Bonilla was assassinated on April 30th, 1984. He was shot by a gunman on a motorcycle while being driven through Bogota. He was 36 years old. 2 men were arrested for the killing. The chain of command led, through subsequent investigations and testimony, back to Pablo Escobar. At the time of the assassination, Maria Victoria was 24 years old and had an infant daughter who was weeks old. She has never directly addressed in any public account what she knew about the Lara Bonilla assassination, or when she knew it. The question has been put to her in various forms over the years, and her responses have consistently moved around the specific rather than engaging it. She has spoken about fear. She has spoken about the chaos of that period. She has spoken about the children. What she has not done is provide a direct account of her knowledge of the decision to kill a government minister, a decision made inside the household she managed by the man she shared a bed with in the weeks following the birth of her daughter. The family fled to Panama shortly after the assassination. The departure was not a vacation, it was a managed evacuation, organized quickly, taking what could be taken and leaving what could not. Maria Victoria packed for herself and two children, a 7-year-old boy and a newborn girl, and left Colombia in the wake of a political murder that had changed the nature of her husband's situation, and by extension, her own. In Panama, Pablo made contact with the Panamanian government, seeking some form of protection or accommodation. The meetings he held there, with officials, with other cartel figures, with intermediaries of various kinds, were not meetings Maria Victoria attended. She was in a rented residence with her children, managing the infant's feeding schedule and the 7-year-old's bewilderment at the abrupt displacement, while Pablo conducted the business of a man trying to negotiate his way out of a crisis he had created. They returned to Colombia after several months. The return was Pablo's decision, made on the basis of calculations that had nothing to do with Maria Victoria's preferences or safety. She came back because the family came back, and she was the family's daily organizer. And there was no version of her life in which she could have remained in Panama with two children and no independent resources, while Pablo returned to Colombia alone. The choice, if it was a choice, had the same architecture as every other choice in her life since she was 15. Its parameters had been set by someone else. Back in Colombia, Pablo's relationship with the state entered its openly violent phase. He was no longer a man who moved through official channels, seeking accommodation and immunity through political participation. He was now in direct conflict with the Colombian government, and the conflict expressed itself in bombings and assassinations and the systematic targeting of officials and civilians alike. The war on extradition, which would define the next decade of Colombian life, had begun. Maria Victoria was in the household while this transition occurred. She was present in the residences where Pablo operated, around the men who carried out his orders, inside the daily rhythms of a domestic life that was organized around a man prosecuting a campaign of political violence. The specific texture of this, what she heard, what she was told, what arrived through the behavior of the people around her, rather than through direct information, is something she has described only in the most general terms. She was there. That much is not in dispute. The political years gave way to the war years, and the transition between them was not gradual. It happened in the space of a few months, from congressional votes to car bombs, from Bogota receptions to Panamanian exile, from the image of the people's representative to the reality of a man whose name was now associated, in the minds of most Colombians, with the systematic murder of public officials. Maria Victoria had been a congressman's wife. She had stood in the photographs, worn the appropriate clothes, performed the necessary silences. And then that version of her life ended, as suddenly as it had begun, and the version that replaced it was darker and more enclosed and offered no social script at all. No defined role, no calendar of events, no institution whose conventions she could borrow to make sense of what she was doing and why. She was 24 years old with two children and a husband who was now one of the most wanted men in Colombia, and whatever she had understood her life to be when she stood in those congressional photographs had already become something she would never be able to fully account for. Medellin in the mid-1980s was a city in the process of being reorganized by violence. The statistics from this period, the homicide rates, the number of car bombings, the count of police officers killed under Pablo's bounty program, are frequently cited in accounts of the era, and they are genuinely staggering. But statistics flatten the texture of what it meant to live inside a city where violence had become so routine that it generated its own social adaptations. People changed their routes. They stopped going to certain neighborhoods. They learned to read the atmosphere of a street. before committing to walking down it. They developed a practiced inattention to certain kinds of sounds, certain kinds of conversations, certain kinds of absences. Maria Victoria was living this in a specific and extreme form. The social world she had inhabited, the extended family networks, the neighborhood connections, the loose web of relationships that constitute a life embedded in a particular community, had been narrowing for years, and by the mid-1980s it had contracted to a very small circle. This was partly a security requirement. Pablo's enemies were numerous and organized, and anyone with access to Maria Victoria had potential access to information about Pablo's location and movements. The people around her were vetted. The contacts she maintained were approved. The phone calls she made and received were in various ways monitored. This is not a metaphor for isolation. It was literal, structural isolation, managed by the same security apparatus that kept Pablo alive and operational. The men who guarded the family, and there were always men, always armed, always present at the edges of the domestic space, were not staff in any ordinary sense. They were extensions of Pablo's control over the environment, and their presence in Maria Victoria's daily life meant that she was never, in any practical sense, alone. She was always observed, always accompanied, always inside a perimeter that had been established by someone else's security calculations. The people who disappeared from her life during this period disappeared in different ways. Some withdrew because the association with Pablo Escobar had become, by the mid-1980s, a liability that ordinary people could not afford. Friends, distant relatives, social acquaintances, people who had been part of the fabric of her earlier life in Envigado and Medellin, quietly stopped making contact. The withdrawal was rarely explicit. It expressed itself in unreturned calls, in excuses that became patterns, in the gradual absence of people who had once been present. Maria Victoria has spoken about this in her accounts with a matter-of-factness that suggests she processed these withdrawals as they happened, understood their logic, and did not permit herself to dwell on them in ways that would have been destabilizing. Others disappeared in a more final sense. The cartel war of the mid-1980s produced casualties across the social spectrum. Not only the police officers and politicians and judges who were targeted, but the people adjacent to those conflicts, the people who were present at the wrong moment, the people who had made themselves inconvenient to someone with the resources to resolve that inconvenience permanently. Maria Victoria knew people in Pablo's world, wives of associates, women she had encountered through the social occasions generated by cartel life. And some of those people died, or their husbands died, or their families were reduced and dispersed by the violence that moved through that world with its own logic and momentum. The Medellin cartel's internal dynamics during this period were not stable. Pablo's relationships with his closest associates, the Ochoa brothers, Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, were productive but not free of tension, and the relationships with figures outside the cartel's core were more volatile still. Men who had been allies became threats or were perceived as threats, and the resolution of those perceptions was violent. Maria Victoria occupied a position inside this world close enough to observe its consequences, but distant enough from its operational center to be protected, in the specific sense that the information she was given was controlled from its full reality. In 1986 and 1987, the war on extradition was producing its most visible casualties. Hernando Baquero Borda, a Supreme Court justice, was killed. Guillermo Cano Isasa, the editor of the newspaper El Espectador, was assassinated in December 1986 outside his offices in Bogotá. Jaime Ramirez Gomez, the head of the anti-narcotics police, had been killed the previous year. These were not anonymous targets. They were public figures whose deaths were reported extensively, whose names were known, whose assassinations constituted a sustained campaign against the institutional infrastructure of the Colombian state. El Espectador had published Pablo's criminal record. Cano had overseen that coverage. His assassination was, in the logic of the campaign, a consequence of journalism, of a newspaper doing what newspapers are supposed to do. Maria Victoria was in Colombia when Cano was killed. She was living inside the domestic life of the man who ordered it, in the household funded by the operation that generated the need to silence critics and destroy institutions. She read newspapers. The coverage of what her husband was doing appeared in those newspapers when the newspapers were still publishing it, before their editors were killed or their buildings were bombed. The bombing of El Espectador's offices came in September 1989, a car bomb that destroyed much of the building. By then, Maria Victoria had been living with the consequences of Pablo's war for years. The bomb was not an abstraction. It was an event in the city she lived in, connected directly to the man she was married to, and it was one in a sequence of such events that had been accumulating for years, without pause. Her mother, Nora, maintained a complicated relationship with Pablo throughout this period. Nora had been the family member who opposed the marriage most clearly at the outset, and the years that followed had not, by any reasonable measure, invalidated her concerns. But the structure of Colombian family life in this context, the obligations of kinship, the material dependencies that Pablo's money created, the social consequences of being seen to distance oneself from the most powerful man in Medellin, made sustained opposition to Pablo a position very few people in Maria Victoria's family could maintain. Nora remained in contact with her daughter. She was part of the household's extended life in the way that mothers are, present at significant moments, involved with the grandchildren, maintaining the relationship through whatever accommodations were necessary to keep it functioning. Pablo's mother, Hermilda Gaviria, was a more straightforwardly devoted presence. She believed in her son with a totality that the accumulating evidence of what he was doing did not penetrate. She defended him publicly and privately. She attributed his violence to the circumstances that had been imposed on him, to the enemies who had made him who he was, to the injustice of a world that targeted self-made men. Her relationship with Maria Victoria was cordial, but not warm. The relationship of two women who shared the same man's domestic world without sharing much else. Hermilda's devotion to Pablo was absolute in a way that Maria Victoria's, by this point, could not have been, because Maria Victoria was too close to the actual daily reality of what the devotion required. The bodyguards who were present in the household were not interchangeable. Some of them had been with the family for years, and their presence had acquired a kind of domesticity. They knew the children's names. They were present at family meals. They occupied the physical space of the home with a familiarity that blurred the line between security apparatus and household member. Juan Pablo has written about specific bodyguards with genuine affection. These were men he had known since early childhood, men who had been a consistent presence when his father had not. Some of them died. The attrition of Pablo's security personnel across the years of the cartel war was significant, and the deaths of men who had been part of the household's daily fabric were absorbed into the family's experience in the particular way that you absorb the deaths of people when death has become routine around you. Not without grief, but without the capacity for the full expression of it, because the grief is never singular, and the circumstances never permit the space that proper mourning requires. By 1987, the family was moving with increasing frequency. The residences they occupied were more temporary, more clearly provisional, safe houses in the practical sense, chosen for their security characteristics rather than their habitability. Maria Victoria was managing the children's education through these relocations, maintaining the tutoring arrangements, trying to preserve some continuity of routine in circumstances that were structurally opposed to continuity. She was 27 years old. She had been married for 11 years. She had spent the majority of those years in conditions that had moved progressively further from anything resembling ordinary life, and the progression had been gradual enough that each stage had seemed like an extension of the previous one, rather than a categorical departure. This is how extreme situations normalize themselves, not through a single dramatic shift, but through the accumulation of small adjustments, each one manageable, each one survivable, until the distance from the starting point is so vast that the starting point is no longer visible. The friends were gone. The social world was gone. The education she might have had was gone. The neighborhood, the ordinary rhythms of a life embedded in a community, all of it had been replaced by the interior of a guarded house, two children who needed her to be steady, and the sustained, daily performance of normalcy inside conditions that were anything but. She kept the performance going. She had no other instrument available to her. In June 1991, Pablo Escobar surrendered to the Colombian government. The surrender was the product of months of negotiation, conducted through lawyers and intermediaries, and its terms were extraordinary by any standard applied to the voluntary incarceration of a man responsible for hundreds of murders and the largest cocaine operation in the world. Pablo would serve his sentence at a facility of his own specification, built on land he selected in the municipality of Envigado, the same municipality where he had grown up, where he still had deep social roots, and where the local officials were, by various accounts, not inclined to create difficulties for him. The facility was called La Catedral. Pablo's lawyers and construction teams built it to his requirements. It sat on a hillside with a view of the valley below. It had a football pitch, a bar, a jacuzzi, a large-screen television, a private suite for Pablo's use, and the capacity to receive guests under conditions that the word prison could not honestly describe. The guards at its perimeter were, in effect, under Pablo's authority rather than the state's. The men imprisoned there with him were his own associates, not fellow inmates in the ordinary sense, but a continuation of the cartel's working structure, relocated to a hillside compound with better amenities than most Colombians had in their own homes. Maria Victoria visited La Catedral. This is documented. She brought the children. She sat with Pablo in the facility he had designed for himself, and conducted what amounted to domestic visits inside a structure that the Colombian government was officially describing as a maximum security prison. These visits were not unusual occurrences. They were regular features of Pablo's incarceration, part of the social life he maintained from within La Catedral, which also included visits from associates, journalists, and various other figures whose presence in a functioning prison would have been immediately questioned. She was 31 years old when Pablo surrendered. Juan Pablo was 14. Manuela was 7. The surrender had been framed, in the public discourse surrounding it, as a resolution. A moment at which the state had reasserted its authority and the years of open warfare had been brought to a kind of conclusion. For Maria Victoria, the practical reality was something different. Pablo was, in a formal sense, incarcerated, but the household's organization had not fundamentally changed. He was still the center around which everything else arranged itself. He was still giving instructions. He was still conducting the business of the cartel, which had not ceased operations because its leader had moved to a hillside compound in Envigado. The visits she made to La Catedral were not visits to a man who had been removed from her daily life. They were visits to a man who had moved the center of operations to a different location. The specific texture of those visits is not something Maria Victoria has described in detail. What she has said, in general terms, is that Pablo was, during this period, more present in the family's life than he had been during the years of active fugitive existence, that the relative stability of his location, even if that location was nominally a prison, allowed for a more regular pattern of contact. Juan Pablo has written about visiting his father at La Catedral with more specificity. He describes a man who was, in that setting, relaxed, who had time for his children, who engaged with them in ways that the chaos of the preceding years had not always permitted. The football pitch was used. There were meals together. There was something that, viewed from inside the family, resembled normalcy. This is one of the more disorienting details of the La Catedral period, that for the immediate family it represented something close to the most stable domestic arrangement they had experienced in years, precisely because the location of Pablo's incarceration was effectively a facility he controlled. The stability was real, in the narrow sense. Its foundation was a corruption of the justice system so complete that it had ceased to function as justice in any meaningful way. Outside La Catedral, the cartel's operations continued. Drug shipments moved. Money was managed. The organization that Pablo had built did not pause because he had formally surrendered to the state. The men who carried out the cartel's operations were not inside La Catedral. They were in Medellin and beyond, operating under instructions that continued to come from the hilltop compound in Envigado. The violence that had defined the preceding years did not immediately cease. People continued to die in ways connected, directly or indirectly, to the operation Pablo was running from his football pitch and his jacuzzi. Maria Victoria was aware that La Catedral was not what it was officially described as being. This requires no inference. She visited regularly. She could see the facility. She was not a naive observer who lacked the information necessary to form a judgment about what she was looking at. What she did with that awareness, how she processed it, whether she permitted herself to name it, what it cost her to continue the visits and the domestic relationship with a man living in conditions of self-designed captivity while the operation he led continued its activities. These are questions her public accounts have not answered with any specificity. In July 1992, the Colombian government, responding to reports of Pablo's continued criminal operations and the murder of 2 cartel members within La Catedral itself, attempted to transfer him to a conventional military facility. Pablo was informed of the transfer in advance, through what channels and by whom has never been fully established. But the evidence suggests strongly that his network inside the government was functional enough to provide warning. On the night of July 22, 1992, Pablo Escobar walked out of La Catedral. He escaped from his own prison. The escape triggered immediate consequences for Maria Victoria and the children. They were in a residence in Medellin when it happened, not at La Catedral. The news of Pablo's escape reached them through the same chaotic rush of information and rumor that reached everyone else, except that for Maria Victoria, the information had a specific, personal dimension. Her husband had escaped from prison. The Colombian government and military would now intensify their effort to find him. Anyone connected to Pablo, family members, known associates, people whose relationship to him was documented, was immediately relevant to that search. The family was moved quickly, safe houses, changed locations. The security apparatus reorganized itself around the new situation. Juan Pablo was 15, old enough to understand what had happened and its implications. Manuela was 8. Maria Victoria managed the immediate relocation while processing the information that the relative stability of the La Catedral period had ended and the fugitive years, the moving, the provisional residences, the sustained proximity to acute danger, had resumed. She has described the period immediately following the escape as one of the most frightening of her life. This is a significant statement from a woman who had spent the preceding decade inside the cartel's world. The specific texture of the fear she describes in this period is different from what she describes in earlier years. Less the background radiation of a dangerous domestic environment, and more the acute, proximate terror of being directly in the path of a manhunt. The Colombian state, embarrassed by the La Catedral situation and under significant pressure from the United States government, was now committed to Pablo's capture or death with a seriousness it had not previously demonstrated. That commitment extended in practice to the people around him. Pablo went underground. He moved constantly, staying in no location long enough to be traced. The communications he used were adapted to reduce the risk of interception. Shorter calls, varied locations, intermediaries, but he maintained contact with his family. He called. He sent messages. He arranged for money to reach them. The relationship did not end with his disappearance into the Medellin underground. It continued, at a distance, through the channels that were still open. Maria Victoria was now in a position that had no clear precedent in her own experience. She was the wife of the most wanted man in Colombia, in a country where the government had demonstrated through the La Catedral debacle that its institutional processes were insufficient to contain him through ordinary means. The search for Pablo involved the Colombian National Police's search block, the Colombian military, the CIA, the DEA, and a vigilante group known as Los Pepis, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, which was conducting its own parallel campaign against the cartel's infrastructure and personnel. Los Pepis targeted not only cartel operatives but property and family connections. Pablo's brother Roberto was imprisoned. Properties associated with the family were seized or destroyed. Maria Victoria and the children were brought in for questioning by Colombian authorities during this period. The sessions were, by her account, extended and repetitive. The same questions returned from different angles, under different conditions, with the implicit pressure of her family's situation applied to whatever she might know about Pablo's whereabouts. She has said she did not know where he was. This is plausible. Pablo's security procedures were designed to limit the number of people who had specific locational information at any given time, and his family's knowledge of his whereabouts was likely deliberately controlled. It is also possible that the truth of what she knew was more complicated than what she disclosed to authorities. The children sat through these sessions with her. Juan Pablo was 16, then turning 17 during the fugitive period. Manuela was 8, 9, 10, moving through the years of her father's final underground existence inside the same conditions that had defined her entire childhood, except that now the danger was acute and proximate rather than ambient. Maria Victoria held the household together. She continued across this period to perform the same function she had performed for years. The organizing, stabilizing presence that kept the children functional, that managed the daily logistics of a life in extraordinary circumstances, that maintained whatever thread of routine was available to maintain. She did this while being questioned by authorities, while being monitored, while receiving communications from a fugitive husband, while watching the world around Pablo contract as the manhunt intensified and the people connected to him died or were imprisoned or fled. The La Catedral period, which had briefly offered something resembling stability, had ended not with a legal resolution, but with an escape that made everything worse, that returned the family to the fugitive existence of the late 1980s, but in conditions of greater danger and more direct government pressure. The brief interlude of visits to a hillside compound, of football pitches and meals together, of something that had looked, from inside, like a family arrangement. All of it was gone, replaced by the final, most dangerous phase of Pablo's existence. And Maria Victoria was inside it, as she had been inside every phase that preceded it, without exit and without the language to describe what being inside it actually required of her. The Medellin that Pablo Escobar moved through after his escape from La Catedral in July 1992 was a city that had been reorganized by his own violence into something he could still navigate, but could no longer control with the ease he once had. The cartel's infrastructure had been significantly degraded. Los Pepes, the vigilante group operating with tacit support from elements of the Colombian state and by various accounts, with intelligence assistance from the CIA and DEA, was dismantling the network systematically, targeting lawyers, accountants, property, personnel. The men who had insulated Pablo from direct exposure were being removed one by one, and the circle of people he could trust and rely on was shrinking in ways that had no precedent in his previous experience. Maria Victoria and the children were not with Pablo during this period in the sense of sharing a residence. He moved too frequently and in conditions too dangerous for the family to be present in the same location. But they were not separated from him in any clean or final sense either. The contact continued. Phone calls, messages passed through intermediaries, the occasional meeting arranged with significant security precautions. Pablo maintained the connection to his family with a persistence that had both emotional and practical dimensions. His family was, for him, a source of genuine feeling in a life that had become almost entirely operational. It was also leverage, something the state and Los Pepes understood, which is why the pressure on Maria Victoria and the children intensified as the manhunt tightened. The Colombian authorities' approach to the family during this period operated on the explicit logic that Maria Victoria and Juan Pablo were potential conduits to Pablo's location. They were not wrong. Pablo called his family. He called more than security protocol recommended, and the calls were a vulnerability that the search block was actively working to exploit. The technology being used to trace Pablo's calls, direction-finding equipment, in part supplied through American intelligence assistance, required only that a call last long enough to be triangulated. Pablo knew this. He tried to keep calls short. He did not always succeed. Maria Victoria and the children were placed at various points during this period under what amounted to supervised residence, in hotels and residences that were monitored, where their movements were controlled and their communications were subject to scrutiny. This was framed officially as protective custody, a measure for their safety in the context of the Los Pepes violence. The protection was real in the narrow sense that Los Pepes did not target Pablo's immediate family with the same directness it targeted other cartel-connected individuals. But the monitoring was also an intelligence operation. The people responsible for their safety were also responsible for gathering whatever information their proximity to Pablo might yield. Juan Pablo was 17 during the most intense phase of the manhunt. He was old enough to understand the situation with considerable clarity, and young enough to be still fundamentally dependent on his mother's management of it. He has written about this period with a detail that his mother's own accounts lack. about specific residences, specific incidents, specific conversations. He describes a young man trying to maintain some sense of himself and his future inside circumstances that seemed to preclude any future at all. He wanted to study. He wanted a life that was not defined entirely by his father's situation. These were not abstract desires. They were the ordinary ambitions of a teenager that the reality around him made almost impossible to act on. Manuela was 10 years old during the final fugitive period. She was a child in the precise sense. Without the cognitive resources to process what was happening, dependent entirely on the adults around her for her sense of what was safe and what was not, what was normal and what was not. Maria Victoria managed Manuela's experience of this period with the same sustained effort she had brought to every previous phase, trying to maintain routine where routine was possible, trying to keep the child's daily life from being entirely consumed by the crisis that surrounded it. Whether she succeeded in this is not something the record can fully assess. Manuela's later difficulties suggest that the accumulated weight of her childhood was not something that could be entirely managed away by even the most sustained maternal effort. Pablo's calls became the organizing anxiety of this period. He called regularly. He called Maria Victoria. He called Juan Pablo. The calls were emotionally real and a father and husband maintaining contact with his family through the only means available, and simultaneously dangerous, because each call was a potential location event. The search block's technical teams were listening, triangulating, refining their picture of Pablo's movements across Medellin. There is a specific episode from this period that appears in multiple accounts, including Juan Pablo's memoir and in the testimony of search block personnel. On one occasion, Pablo called the family's monitored residence. The call lasted longer than it should have. The triangulation teams were working, narrowing the location. Pablo, somehow sensing the danger, whether through a specific signal or through the instinct that had kept him alive through years of being hunted, ended the call abruptly and moved. The raid that followed found evidence of his recent presence, but not Pablo himself. He had missed capture by minutes. Maria Victoria was in the room when that call ended. She heard the abrupt disconnection. She knew what it meant, in the way that you know things after years of living inside a situation whose rhythms you have absorbed without choosing to. The call ending suddenly meant he had run. Whether he had run in time was information she did not have and would not have until the next contact, if there was a next contact. This is what the fugitive period actually looked like from inside the family. Not the dramatic pursuit narrative that the manhunt has been turned into in subsequent accounts and dramatizations, but the sustained, grinding anxiety of waiting. For calls that came and for calls that did not come. For news that arrived through official channels and unofficial ones. For the knock on the door that meant either safety or its opposite. The financial situation was deteriorating significantly. Pablo's ability to access his assets was increasingly compromised. The cartel's infrastructure for moving money had been damaged by the sustained pressure on its personnel. Properties had been seized, accounts had been frozen, or were inaccessible. The family was not destitute. Pablo maintained resources even in his most constrained periods, and he continued to direct money toward his family's maintenance. But the extraordinary material abundance of the Hacienda Napoli's years was entirely gone, and what replaced it was a financially precarious existence, organized around whatever could be accessed without triggering further legal consequences. Maria Victoria managed this financial deterioration alongside everything else. The household expenses, the security costs, the children's ongoing needs. All of this required management under conditions that provided very little of the stability that financial management requires. She has described this aspect of the period in practical terms. The logistics of it, the problem-solving it required, with a pragmatism that suggests she approached the material constraints as a concrete problem to be solved rather than as a component of a larger situation whose weight she allowed herself to feel in full. In September 1993, the family was in a residential building in Medellin, in a neighborhood called Los Olivos, living under assumed names. The building had been secured as well as circumstances permitted. It was, by the standards of the previous months, a relatively stable arrangement. They had been there for a period. The security had held. The routine had established itself. Pablo was elsewhere in the city, maintaining his separate location and his careful communications. He called on December 2nd, 1993. The call lasted longer than it should have. The search block's direction-finding teams were operating. The triangulation worked. Colombian National Police units were deployed to a house on a residential street in the Los Olivos neighborhood. The operation that followed lasted approximately an hour. Pablo Escobar was shot on the rooftop of the building, attempting to flee across the connected rooftops. He was 44 years old. Maria Victoria learned of her husband's death through the same chaotic convergence of official announcement and rumor that reached the rest of Colombia on the afternoon of December 2nd. The specific moment of learning, who told her, in what form the information arrived, what she said or did not say, is not something she has described in detail in any public account. What followed the moment of learning is somewhat more documented. The immediate security situation around the family became acutely dangerous because Pablo's death removed the primary reason the Colombian state had for keeping them alive and protected, while simultaneously making them targets for the various enemies and aggrieved parties who had accumulated across the years of the cartel war. The celebration of Pablo's death in parts of Colombia was extensive and public. There were people in Medellin and Bogotá and across the country for whom December 2nd, 1993 was a day of genuine relief, people who had lost family members to the car bombs and assassinations. People who had lived for years under the specific terror of a man who had made civilian casualties a deliberate instrument of political pressure. The celebration was not irrational. It was the expression of real suffering that had real causes. Maria Victoria was 33 years old on December 2nd, 1993. She had been married to Pablo Escobar since she was 15. She had spent 18 years inside the domestic world of a man who had reorganized Colombian society around his own power and killed hundreds of people in the process of building and defending it. She had raised 2 children inside that world. She had managed the household, performed the public role, absorbed the fear, tolerated the infidelities, sat through the interrogations, packed and unpacked across years of provisional residences, and visited a man in a prison he had designed for himself. And now he was dead on a rooftop in Los Olivos, and the life she had organized around his existence, in every dimension, including the dimensions she had not chosen, had ended with him. And what remained was a 33-year-old woman with 2 children, a name that was now the most recognizable symbol of criminal violence in Latin American history. No independent financial resources, no education beyond early secondary school, and no country in the world that was prepared to receive her without consequences. The fugitive years had been, in a specific and terrible sense, a preparation for this. She had spent years learning to move, to adapt, to manage survival under conditions that foreclosed ordinary planning. Those skills were now the primary resources she had. They were not enough for what came next, but they were what she had. The body was photographed extensively. Colombian National Police officers posed beside it on the rooftop of the Los Olivos house, and the photographs circulated immediately. Through news agencies, through television broadcasts, across the international wire services that had been waiting for this particular image for years. The confirmation that Pablo Escobar was dead was delivered to the world through pictures of his corpse, and those pictures reached Maria Victoria through the same channels they reached everyone else. Through a television screen, through the news that was playing in whatever secured residence the family was occupying when the afternoon of December 2nd became the evening of December 2nd, and the information stopped being rumor and became fact. She went to identify the body. This is documented. Maria Victoria, with Juan Pablo and members of Pablo's immediate family, went to the clinic where the body had been taken following the rooftop operation. They saw him. Juan Pablo, 17 years old, stood in that room and looked at his father's body, and has described the experience in his memoir with a directness that does not attempt to resolve the contradictions it contains. Grief for a father, horror at what the father had been, the specific disorientation of mourning, someone whose death the rest of the country was celebrating in the streets. Maria Victoria has not described that room in detail in any public account. She has said she wept. She has said she loved him. She has said, in the careful formulation she returns to when the question of her feelings about Pablo is pressed, that it is possible to love someone and to know that the world is better without them, and that these two things do not cancel each other out. This is not evasion. It is a truthful description of a psychological state that most people are not required to inhabit, and the fact that she arrived at it suggests a reckoning with her own experience that was neither simple nor comfortable. The celebration outside was audible. Medellin was not a city in mourning on December 2nd, 1993. The sounds of a city expressing collective relief, not universal, not uncomplicated, but real and loud and immediate, were the sonic backdrop to whatever was happening in that clinical room where Pablo's body lay and his family stood around it. The days that followed were organized almost entirely by threat assessment. Los Pepes and its associated networks remained active. Pablo's death had not dissolved the enmities generated by 18 years of cartel warfare, and several of those enmities had specific personal dimensions that extended to his family. The Castaño brothers, who had been central to Los Pepes, made communications in the days after Pablo's death that were interpreted by the family and their remaining security as indicating potential danger to Pablo's immediate relatives. Whether these communications constituted actual operational threats or were expressions of contempt and intimidation is not fully clear from the available record, but the family's response, treating them as real, was not irrational given the context. Juan Pablo, 17, made a public statement in the days after his father's death. He appeared before cameras and spoke, a teenager visibly frightened, making a statement that attempted to distance the family from Pablo's violence while also acknowledging his grief. The statement was watched and assessed and dissected by journalists, by government officials, by the families of Pablo's victims, by everyone with a stake in what the Escobar family's existence would mean in the post-Pablo period. It was also, in the most basic sense, a child trying to say something true about an impossible situation in front of cameras he had no experience with, while his mother and sister waited somewhere nearby in a secured residence. The Colombian government's position on the family hardened quickly. There was a significant asset recovery operation underway, the seizure and accounting of Pablo's property and financial holdings, a process complicated enormously by the opacity of the cartel's financial structures, by the money that had been moved into property and accounts across multiple countries, and by the straightforward impossibility of tracing assets that had been deliberately distributed through layers of intermediaries and front companies over decades. What remained legally attributable to Pablo, and therefore subject to seizure, was seized. What the family could access in the immediate aftermath was a fraction of the wealth that had defined their material existence. Maria Victoria's financial situation in the weeks and months following Pablo's death was precarious in ways that had no precedent in her experience. She had lived inside extraordinary material abundance, had never, in the 18 years of her marriage, been required to manage a budget or consider ordinary financial constraints. The money had been a constant. It had arrived in quantities that made questions about its source academic. Now the primary source was dead. The assets were being seized, the accounts were under scrutiny, and the ability to access what remained was compromised at every turn by legal proceedings and the practical impossibility of moving money without generating official attention. She attempted in the months following Pablo's death to access certain assets and financial holdings. These attempts were monitored and in several cases blocked. She was questioned again by Colombian authorities. Different questions now focused on the location of assets rather than the location of her husband, with the same sustained, repetitive quality that the earlier interrogations had. She maintained consistently that her knowledge of Pablo's financial structures was limited. This claim was met with the same skepticism that had greeted her earlier claims about the limits of her knowledge, and the skepticism was again not entirely unreasonable. She was also in this period a target of civil litigation. The families of Pablo's victims, people who had lost relatives to the cartel's bombings and assassinations, people whose lives had been directly destroyed by the operation Maria Victoria had lived inside, were pursuing legal claims against the Escobar estate. The specific legal mechanisms available to them varied, and the practical prospects of recovering anything meaningful from an estate that had been largely seized or hidden were limited. But the claims were made, and Maria Victoria was named in them, and the process of defending against them, while simultaneously managing the family's security situation, the children's needs, and the basic logistics of survival, constituted an additional layer of pressure on an already overwhelmed existence. No country wanted them. This is the blunt fact of the family's situation in 1994. They approached multiple governments, Germany, Mozambique, Brazil, Ecuador, seeking the right to live as residents or citizens under new identities. Each approach was rejected. The name Escobar, even attached to a widow and two children who had committed no documented crimes, was not a name any government was prepared to absorb without consequences. The rejections arrived through diplomatic channels, through formal legal processes, through the simple practical reality that no country was willing to accept the political cost of being seen to provide refuge to the family of the man who had, for a decade, defined the global cocaine trade. They stayed in Colombia. They moved between residences, still requiring security, still managing the practical reality of being the most recognizable criminal family in the country. The house in El Poblado, the upscale Medellin neighborhood where they had lived during the La Catedral period, had been sold or seized. They lived in smaller, less visible residences, in circumstances that were defined by what they were hiding from, rather than by any positive conception of what they were building. Pablo's brother Roberto was in prison, having been convicted on charges related to the cartel's operations. Hermilda, Pablo's mother, was living in conditions significantly reduced from the ones her son's wealth had provided. The social world of the cartel, the extended network of family members, associates, and dependents who had organized their lives around Pablo's operation, had dispersed or been destroyed, and what remained of it offered Maria Victoria nothing useful. The men who had provided security were gone or in prison or dead. The financial infrastructure was dismantled. The social connections that had sustained the household's daily function no longer existed in any coherent form. She made decisions during this period that have attracted significant retrospective attention, and whose moral dimensions are not simple. She wrote letters to government officials, she engaged lawyers, she attempted to negotiate some form of arrangement that would allow the family to leave Colombia and establish themselves somewhere with new identities. In doing so, she was navigating a situation that had been created entirely by someone else's choices, while also being inescapably part of the structure that those choices had built. The distinction between victim and beneficiary, which was clear enough in its extremes, was genuinely difficult to locate in the specific middle ground she occupied. She had not ordered the deaths. She had not signed the contracts. She had not built the cartel or directed its operations. These things are true. She had also lived inside the material wealth those operations produced, had raised her children in houses funded by cocaine, had performed the public role of a cartel boss's wife in ways that provided his enterprise with the social legitimacy of a functioning family, had maintained relationships with men she knew to be killers, and had stayed, through choice and through the absence of visible alternatives, in proportions that cannot be precisely determined from the outside, when she might have left. The distinction between these two truths is where Maria Victoria's story actually lives, in the space between them, in the daily reality of a woman who was shaped by a force she had not chosen and who made accommodations to that force that she has never been fully required to account for. Juan Pablo, now calling himself Sebastian after his father's death, was trying to finish his schooling under circumstances that made normal educational participation nearly impossible. Manuela was 10 years old, quiet and withdrawn in the accounts of people who encountered the family during this period, a child who had never experienced ordinary life and who was now experiencing extraordinary loss in conditions that provided no space for ordinary grief. Maria Victoria held the three of them together. She had no other function now, no other role that the world was offering her. She was Pablo Escobar's widow in a country that had celebrated his death, with two children who carried his name, in a legal and financial situation that was deteriorating, in a security situation that remained genuinely dangerous, with no country willing to accept her and no identity available to her other than the one she had been given at 15. She prayed. She has said this. She attended Mass. She maintained the Catholic practice that had been part of her upbringing and that she had never entirely abandoned. even through the years in which its teachings and the reality of her daily life had been in conditions of sustained, unacknowledged contradiction. She waited. For what exactly is not clear from her accounts of this period? For the legal situation to clarify, for the security situation to stabilize, for some path forward to become visible in the wreckage of the life that December 2nd had ended. The waiting had the quality of all waiting that follows catastrophe, purposeful in its surface organization, hollow in its actual experience, because the catastrophe is present in every moment, and the future it has foreclosed is more vivid than any future that might actually arrive. The name Escobar remained. Everything else was gone or going or had never fully been hers in the first place. In 1994, Maria Victoria Henao began the legal process of changing her name. The decision was practical before it was anything else. The name Escobar had become, in Colombia and beyond, a designation that foreclosed ordinary existence, that triggered official attention, that made financial transactions impossible, that preceded her into every room she entered and determined how she would be received there before she had said a word. She changed her name to Maria Isabel Santos Caballero. Juan Pablo became Juan Sebastián Marroquín Santos. Manuela became Juana Manuela Marroquín Santos. The legal process of the name change was completed in Colombia, but the name change itself did not immediately resolve the practical problem it was intended to address because the family situation was too well documented and too widely known for new paperwork to constitute a functional new identity. Colombian journalists knew who they were. Colombian officials knew who they were. The people who had reasons, legal, political, personal, to maintain attention on them knew who they were. The new names were necessary, but not sufficient. What was also required was geography, distance, the practical erasure that comes from being in a place where the name recognition that made existence in Colombia impossible had not yet reached. The search for a country that would receive them continued through 1994 and into 1995. The rejections that had come in the immediate aftermath of Pablo's death continued, country by country, as the family's lawyers and intermediaries made contact with governments and received formal or informal refusals. The reasons given varied: immigration law, security concerns, political considerations. But the underlying logic was consistent. No government wanted the visible complication of Pablo Escobar's family establishing residence within its borders, and the visibility was guaranteed because the family's story was too large and too documented to be contained by new paperwork. They eventually reached Argentina. The specific pathway through which the family arrived in Buenos Aires in the mid-1990s has not been fully documented in any public account, partly because the arrangements that made it possible were designed to minimize documentation. What is known is that by the late 1990s, Maria Victoria and her children were living in Buenos Aires under their new names, in an apartment in a middle-class neighborhood, in conditions that were, by the standards of every previous period of their lives, remarkably ordinary. Ordinary is a relative term. The apartment in Buenos Aires was not Hacienda Nápoles. It was not the guarded residences of the cartel years or the provisional safe houses of the fugitive period. It was an apartment, furnished, functional, in a city that did not know who they were, where the daily logistics of existence could proceed without the immediate overlay of threat and surveillance that had defined every previous context they had inhabited. Maria Victoria cooked. She went to the market. She attended Mass at a local church. Juan Pablo, now Sebastian, enrolled in a university. Manuela, now a teenager, attempted to build something resembling an ordinary adolescence. The financial situation remained constrained. The wealth that had defined the material reality of the Escobar household had not survived the seizures and the legal proceedings and the practical impossibility of accessing hidden assets without triggering the official attention they were trying to avoid. Maria Victoria managed the household in Buenos Aires on resources that were a fraction of what had once been available, a reduction so extreme that it constituted a different category of existence rather than simply a different point on the same scale. She had lived inside extraordinary abundance. She was now living with careful attention to ordinary expenses. And the gap between those two realities was not something that could be crossed without a sustained reorganization of the relationship between money and meaning that she had absorbed across 18 years of marriage. She did not give interviews during the Buenos Aires years. She did not seek public attention. She maintained the invisibility that the new names were designed to provide. And she maintained it with the same practice discipline she had brought to every performance the previous decades had required of her. The performance was different now. Not the congressman's wife at a Bogota reception, not the cartel boss's wife at Hacienda Nápoles, but the ordinary middle-class woman at the Buenos Aires market. And it required its own kind of sustained attention to the gap between what was shown and what was known. Juan Pablo's decision to write a memoir and to give public interviews about his father and his family was made without Maria Victoria's full endorsement. He has been careful to say this in his own accounts, that his mother's preference was for continued privacy, that the decision to speak publicly was his own, made for reasons that included his genuine conviction that acknowledging the truth of what his father had done was a moral responsibility he could not avoid. The memoir, published in Spanish in 2009 as Pablo Escobar, Mi Padre, and later translated and published internationally, brought the family's story back into wide public circulation in ways that the Buenos Aires years had worked to avoid. Maria Victoria eventually gave her own account. She published a memoir in Spanish, Mrs. Escobar, My Life with Pablo, that appeared in 2019, more than 25 years after Pablo's death. The book is written in her own voice, or in the voice she has constructed across decades of managing the story of her own life, and it is a document that rewards reading with a particular kind of attention, not for what it reveals directly, because what it reveals directly is carefully managed, but for what the management itself discloses about the weight she has been carrying and the specific shape it has pressed into her. She writes about love. She writes about it with a persistence that is one of the more unsettling qualities of the book, because the love she describes is genuine, is, by every indication, the real emotional experience she had of her relationship with Pablo. And it coexists in the book with accounts of behavior that the word love cannot redeem or explain. She loved a man who ordered the deaths of hundreds of people. She has said this essentially in those terms. She has not resolved it because it does not resolve. She has held it for 30 years in the same way that she held every other impossible piece of information her life produced. By continuing to function, by keeping the children alive and as intact as possible, by not permitting herself the full weight of what she was carrying, because the full weight would have been unsurvivable. Manuela's adult life has been the most privately guarded aspect of the family's post-Pablo existence. She does not speak publicly. She does not give interviews. What filters through the limited reporting on her situation describes significant psychological difficulty, an inability to sustain ordinary social and professional functioning, a life shaped at its core by the childhood she had and by the loss she experienced at 10 years old, and by the years of displacement and concealment that followed. She has reportedly received psychiatric treatment. She has reportedly struggled in ways that Juan Pablo's more public and seemingly more functional adult existence has not. Maria Victoria has spoken about Manuela in her memoir and in interviews with a restraint that is qualitatively different from the restraint she applies to other subjects. When she writes about Manuela, the careful management falls away slightly. Or rather, it becomes visible as management, which is its own kind of disclosure. She is a mother writing about a child whose suffering she could not prevent and whose current difficulty she cannot resolve, and the gap between those two facts and the love that persists across them is the most privately honest aspect of her public account. The Buenos Aires identity was eventually compromised. Argentine immigration authorities identified the family in the late 1990s and moved to deport them. The process was contested legally and generated renewed media attention. The revelation that Pablo Escobar's family had been living in Buenos Aires under assumed names was, in journalistic terms, a significant story, and it was covered as such. The family's lawyers argued against deportation. The legal proceedings took time. During this period, the invisibility they had built was gone, and the Buenos Aires apartment, which had been for several years something close to a genuine home, became provisional again. Occupied under conditions of renewed exposure, the ordinariness of the preceding years revealed as something that had existed on borrowed time. They were eventually permitted to remain in Argentina. The legal proceedings resolved in their favor on the basis that they had committed no crimes in Argentina and that deportation to Colombia would expose them to genuine danger. They stayed. They are in Argentina still, by what the available public information indicates, living in Buenos Aires under names that are now widely known despite the decades of effort to contain them, in circumstances that are defined by the specific inheritance of being Pablo Escobar's surviving family. Maria Victoria is in her mid-60s now. She has outlived her husband by more than 30 years. She has outlived the cartel, the war, the decade of manhunts, the fugitive years, the interrogations, the asset seizures, the country rejections, the identity changes, the Buenos Aires exposure, the memoir publications, the documentary series, the television dramas that have turned her husband's life into entertainment, watched by hundreds of millions of people worldwide. She has outlived all of it, and she is still here, still carrying the name she was born with, even as she lives under the name she chose. Still the woman who was 15 in a white dress at a neighborhood gathering in Envigado in 1975 when a 25-year-old man decided she was the one he wanted. She went to confession, she has said, after Pablo's death. She went regularly. She has described confession as one of the few contexts in which she was able to speak without managing what she said, in which the performance could briefly be suspended and the thing beneath it could be approached, if not fully named. What she said in those confessionals is, appropriately, not part of the record. What happened in those rooms stayed there. The priest heard it. She carried it back out into the world with her when she left. Somewhat lighter, perhaps, never fully unburdened. The Netflix series Narcos, which began airing in 2015, dramatized Pablo Escobar's life and the cartel years with a production quality and a global distribution that reached audiences far beyond anything previous accounts had managed. Maria Victoria appears in it as a character, a version of her, performed by an actress, shaped by the narrative requirements of a streaming drama. The version of her that appears in Narcos is not the version she would have chosen. No version anyone else constructs of a person is the version they would have chosen. But the Narcos version of Maria Victoria Henao reached more people than her own memoir did, and it exists in the cultural record, alongside the memoir, alongside the documented history, alongside the careful accounts she has given in interviews. Another layer of representation added to a life that has been represented by others since she was 15 years old. She has said she does not watch it. Maria Victoria Henao is still alive. This is, on reflection, not an unremarkable fact. The world she inhabited for 18 years consumed most of the people inside it. The associates, the bodyguards, the lawyers, the politicians who made accommodations, the journalists who got too close. The Colombian state nearly collapsed under the pressure of what Pablo built. Thousands of people died. The city of Medellin spent a decade as one of the most violent places on earth. And the woman who sat at Pablo Escobar's table, who raised his children, who managed his household through all of it, she is in Buenos Aires in her mid-60s, still here. What her survival means exactly is not a question the record answers cleanly. She was not the architect of what happened. She was also not simply its passive witness. The space between those two positions is where the actual truth of her life resides, and it is a space that does not have a comfortable name. She was 15 when it began. She was 33 when the central fact of her existence was shot dead on a rooftop. Everything before that was shaped by a force she had not chosen. Everything after has been shaped by what that force left behind in her finances, in her children, in the name she carries, in the confessionals she has returned to across 3 decades trying to find language for the things that have no language. The hippos are still in the Magdalena Medio rivers. Pablo imported them, and they outlasted him, spreading through the waterways, breeding in the Colombian landscape, uncontainable. Ecologists continue to argue about what to do with them. They are there because a man once wanted everything, and the wanting had consequences that no one has yet been able to fully resolve. Juan Pablo Sebastian has built a life as an architect and a public advocate for what he calls a culture of peace. traveling to speak about his father's violence and its costs. He has met with the children of people Pablo killed. He has sought forgiveness in ways that are public and deliberate, and that have attracted both genuine respect and significant skepticism. His mother has not followed him into that public space. She has given her account in her memoir and in selected interviews, but she has not made the active public processing of her husband's legacy a visible project in the way her son has. Manuela has not spoken. Whatever she carries from her childhood at Hacienda Nápoles, from the fugitive years, from the decade that followed, it remains private, held inside a life that the public record cannot access. She is the part of this story that remains entirely unresolved, entirely interior, entirely her own. Maria Victoria has said she forgives Pablo. She has said this in her memoir, in interviews, with the consistency of someone who has worked toward a position and arrived at it through sustained effort rather than arriving there easily. Whether forgiveness in this context means what the word usually means, whether it is a resolution, a release, an arrival at some form of peace, or whether it is something more complicated, a word she has reached for because the alternatives are worse, is not something she has clarified, and may not be something she can. What is left, in the end, is a woman whose life was taken hold of before she was old enough to understand what was being taken, who survived what most people would not have survived, who kept her children alive through circumstances that had no precedent, who has told her story carefully and partially, and with the specific omissions of someone who knows exactly which truths would cost more than she is prepared to pay. The record contains her, but it does not contain all of her. The rest stayed in the confessional, or in the rooms the cameras never entered, or in the distance between what she has said and what she has not said, which is, in the story of Maria Victoria Henao, a distance that no document has closed, and that no account, including this one, will fully cross.